Three, two, one. Welcome to another episode of the KAJ Convos podcast. We're taking a little bit of a turn from our regular scheduled interview series and going back to the founders conversation that we referenced at the very beginning of in the very first episode. I think the original intent of this podcast was not only for us to learn from other entrepreneurs, but it was also to try and get into the minds of Kohl and I as we go through this journey of starting a company.
Right.
So we were actually just talking about this not even 5 minutes before we pressed record here. And so what we want to have this founders series or these founders conversations is that we want to show our take on what it means to start a company. So that involves so it'll be a little bit of storytelling, but it'll talk about some of the challenges, some of the stresses that we've gone through, some of the opportunities that it has led to, as well as just like our general mindset over the past almost year now. So we have a few stories. This might be a little bit more businessy than you guys are probably used to, because we're going to get into potentially some of the background of us starting the company. If you like this, please let us know. If you want us to just keep interviewing people, just let us know as well.
Yeah.
But we're just going to get right into it.
Yeah.
So I'll paint a little bit of the picture to start. So I referenced this story in the first episode that we had, but in December to January-ish of 2019, you and I started to heavily talk about this idea of developing a software company that helps people better manage their personal finances.
Right.
Right. Like it was a long time coming, but that's when we started to actually like get the ball rolling and start to figure out like the actual details of what this all means.
Right. I mean, for sure. I think we'd landed on the idea, and December was really, because that was my first month of being excommunicado from a previous company that left in late November. And then December was hitting the ground running as best we could. And there's a little bit of setup, but that was definitely when both minds were fully free to start thinking about it and start making moves towards where we are now, and then really kind of hitting the ground running in January.
But that was, so I'm even talking about the year before that. 2019, January 2019. Yeah.
Okay.
So
yeah.
even
I was
before,
like, I talked about a couple months ago.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
No.
Yeah.
I'm talking about long time ago when the
Yeah.
idea first started to come to fruition, where we recognized that there was an idea, and we recognized that like we could build a business around that. And so that was, everything was so fresh. We were still at the old company.
Yeah.
And we were still trying to figure out exactly, because again, we talked about this in the first episode, but we've had a bunch of ideas and we've tossed around a couple of things, especially when we were living together. There's a couple ideas here and there that we always played around with, even dabbled our toes into, but we never took the full plunge. But this was the first thing that we actually thought that, okay, there is an idea around here, but how does that all work? And then that idea of starting this software company led us down a path of learning how to start a company, from incorporating and just like the back end structure that needed to be put in place.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of the full circle, but that's how we started December 2018 going into January 2019.
Yeah. And
between January 2019 and June of 2019, when I left Acerna, you and I had a bunch of conversations, and we were strategizing the entire time. Little did our old company know that we were trying to make moves. But it took us a solid 6 months to, I guess, like not only commit to the idea or like have a better framework of the idea, but also like commit to like you and I both taking the full leap into quitting that job and then joining here. And then, which leads into the first story that Kohl and I want to talk about. And so for those of you who don't know about incorporation, the long story short is you're developing a legal entity that is its own entity that resides outside of both Kohl and my personal assets or liabilities. So it's its own entity that exists. And the main reason why most people want to incorporate is because it just removes us from potential liability and potential risk because it's its own standing thing. Now, obviously, there is personal risk that goes involved in that, but just from a legal perspective, that's the main reason why most people incorporate. And then on top of that, when you incorporate, because it's not like a sole proprietorship or a partnership, which just like Kohl and I own. How a corporation works is that there are shares that need to be divided up into the company. And so one of the things that we talked about, or Kohl and I had to figure out originally, was how does the equity and how do the shares split? Not just between the two of us, but also we have grand visions of growing this company into a much bigger, much larger organization, which will entail investments from outside, whether it's angel investors or seed investors, venture capitalists, whatever. And we wanted to set the company structure up right at the start so that we weren't having to backpedal when the time came that we needed to raise that money. And that's something that personally, through whether it's through school or whether it's through my experience with Acerna, having pretty big involvement with them on their back end and their corporate organizational structure, that I wanted to make sure that we got right at the start, because I know the headaches that it could lead to, the potential headaches that it could lead to down the road.
Yeah.
So let's start there. Let's start with just the two of us and the conversation that we had.
And so this is, again, hopefully I can provide some flavor for the non-businessy folk, because that's kind of where I was when we were going into a lot of this stuff. I didn't take business. I took a technical degree, doing technical work, and getting the flavors of business along the way. So I had said early, and we'd referenced this before, that, the two of us together, we have complementary skill sets, and so we need to lean on each other to help build a full picture and make each other better and build a really strong foundation. So I said to you early, this is one area where I'm kind of leaning on you and leaning on and trusting. This is where you need to have good trust with whoever you're doing stuff with, because I said, I'm going to trust you to keep my interests, in a good place. And when it comes to the structure, I'm kind of going to trust you on a lot of the setup. So right. You're the spearhead on getting it set up and getting the initial conversations going. And then I was kind of there for flavor to make sure that things made sense in my head.
Right. And again, so for context of how it all happened, is we worked with a local law firm here in Calgary that was their startup company program helps small emerging companies like ours get that company structure in place. And it is a little bit more, it's a lot of documents. It's quite frankly very boring, but it's very mandatory and it's very important. And a lot of these documents are potentially overkill for the point that we were at, which was ideation. Like, we didn't have any real plan or anything in place yet.
No IP to protect or...
Exactly. But it was more that it was the risk I saw. It wasn't even the risk. It was more the opportunity to get things right at the start and not repeat other people's mistakes. Right. Yeah. And so maybe we did overkill it a little bit at the start, because, to be quite frank, we haven't really referenced or used many of those documents since June May-ish, June-ish, when we officially incorporated.
Yeah.
But it is important to have, and the due diligence that we put in at that time, I think, was important. The big thing that to talk about, like, one of the challenges or potential stresses about that story in particular, was we did have a little bit of a disagreement at the start about the breakdown between Kohl and I. So again, to give context, it's like, let's pretend that our company had 100 shares, which represented each share represents a portion of ownership of the company. There's a million different ways to break down shares and between founders. I would bet that any company that you think of, for the most part, that is a very complicated and very weird situation to think about, like who owns what percentage of what in each company. To, I guess, jump to the conclusion, and then we'll talk to the story of how we got there. We did end up just going down like the more easy route of just going 50-50. And so as of today, the company that Kohl and I both own, we own 50% each, which again could potentially change in the future once we bring on other investors. But as of today, Kohl and I are both equal owners of our number co company.
But I do like the story, how we got to 50-50, because I think it highlights the challenges and even early stresses of before we've even started. We were headbutting a little bit on some stuff, and there's some stress there, and then ultimately we resolved it, which we always do. But in between was a little bit of each other balancing each other out to find something that we thought was going to work.
Right.
And I can highlight, I guess, a little bit of that is the way that we're building out the equity structure, or the percentage split, was based on a couple different properties or metrics, such that we could put a measurable element to determining those percentages based on some reasonable things, such as when did each of us start working on the company full time? When did we leave our job? What's the associated risk with each of these different aspects? There's a couple things in there, like if down the road, if we were going to be making revenue and bringing in some salary, how much of that salary were we actually going to be paying ourselves? Are we going to be reducing that and keeping money in the company? So a couple of things to identify which would give a fair breakdown of equity split. And so there was one really obvious one at the beginning that was different between the two of us, which was Adrian left his job at Acerna much earlier than I did, probably about 5 months or so, because I was getting married and needed some cash flow still. And so we were determining, because of that time difference, because of, and maybe I want to make sure to explain it in a good manner so it makes sense, but there's associated risk and there's associated opportunity cost for Adrian leaving earlier, and the argument is that that should be reflected potentially in the equity split, which I thought was super fair. And so we're playing with the weightings on these different metrics to find out, how this is all going to play out. This is kind of a long-winded way about getting to it, but if you just plugged it in one way, obviously you could turn the knobs on it and get it to something that was reasonable. But just even by default, there was that time difference was going to sway the equity split in a direction that I ultimately thought was going to not work out in the long run.
Right. And so to condense that, I made it so like I think the big thing that we struggled with at that time was the value of that time difference, right? Yeah. Because the reality was I was over my job at Acerna and I was going to leave that company at that point, regardless of what we were doing or not, right? Yeah. Whether it was to start a company with you, to start a company on my own, or to join a different organization, my time had run out at Acerna, and there was other events that led me to being able to take that opportunity to reset. So that time frame happened to coincide with the busiest potential summer of anyone that I've ever known, which was your summer, which was your brother got married. Yeah, you were the best man. Yeah, you got married. Yeah, and so the bachelor parties and just life happened, right? And so
the weddings.
Yeah. And so the timing of it made it so that it didn't make much sense for Kohl to leave the same time frame I did. And then it was one of those things where it's like we both understood where each other was, right? Like Kohl equally knew my frustrations with the old company and how I wanted to leave. And I also knew the stresses that he was about to go through, because as I was leaving, his summer of busyness started ramping up. So like they definitely intersected, going the opposite ways. Yeah. And so as we were just talking about it, because I knew that I was leaving early, the big thing in my mind was, in the ideal state, I think that, like, and I told this to you a bunch of times, but the ideal state was for us to always be 50-50. Yeah. Because again, we don't know where this is going, and we don't know what this eventually leads to, but there's no need for us to like have this almost disdain for each other at the very start for no reason. Yeah. Right. And so it was really just a matter of, in the time frame between me leaving and you leaving, what is the value of that time and how is that reflected in the equity share? Yeah. And the way that we developed the metric model that like split up the equity definitely was potentially overvaluing that time frame. That made it significantly different, that caused you to like have some trepidation to like doing that, or to joining, or to jumping on, right? And that ultimately wasn't going to work, at least in my mind, is that this only works if you and I both do this together, because of, like we referenced again before, the complementary skill sets. Yeah. And so it was a matter of, like, from my perspective, I was always okay with going the 50% route, or the 50-50 split. But where it was, the reason I think I was at the time pushing for some level of like risk management was because we weren't clear, or at least I wasn't clear about when you were leaving or if you were leaving. Yeah. Right. So there was this weird risk of like, what if I wait for 5 months, I draw down my own savings, and then you just say like, I don't want to leave. I'm good where I'm at. So like that was like, so I'm like, well, fuck, like I can't like throw away not all of my savings, but like enough savings for 4 or 5 months, which is like me just like sitting there waiting. Yeah. Eventually we got to the point where,
which was fair.
Yeah. Yeah.
As I was looking at it the whole time from my side, seeing what you're going through, and I was like, this is really fair. I think we're on the same page, and we're just trying to get them synced together now.
Right. Exactly.
And yeah, I think, like, I don't know.
I think at the end of the day, like, cooler heads prevailed, and like we got down to, it was one of those things where, like, it's like we were both talking, but we were always like, it was like there was a bit where we were talking around different like potential risks that we saw in different issues. But as soon as we made it like very clear, and like you were certain that it was the Q4 of 2019, and I was like, okay, like that's fine. It doesn't matter.
I think that's, to kind of wrap up that piece, was it'd gotten to the point where we were looking at the model, and it was, I think I'd said at one point, you know, if the split was so swayed, or kind of weighted too heavily in one direction or the other, if we were going to be successful long term, for every, say, dollar of value that I put into the company, if that meant that you got $2 of value out of that, is like, how do you not, like, how do you avoid resentment at that point if it's because of this time difference, but we're down 10 years down the road, and we're doing something amazing. Right. But every dollar value that I put in, you get $2 out of it, and we started it basically together, and we've climbed it for 10 years. Yeah. I was thinking, well, that seems crazy. So that's when I think I asked, I was like, okay, so that doesn't make sense to me. I want it to be 50-50. Like, what do we got to do to get it there? Right. And I was getting you a date. Yeah. Date that I was leaving, and date that we were going full time. Yeah. Stick through it.
Yeah. And yeah, not to belabor the point, but at the end of the day, in a perfect world, we would have both left at the exact same time. Yeah. And none of this would have been even like a conversation to have. But it did in hindsight take longer to get to that conclusion because we weren't just straight up about like this at the very beginning, what each other's concerns were before we moved on. Right. And I think that that's one thing that starting a company has exposed almost, because you and I have worked together in a lot of projects and whatnot together, but we were working under the confines of what the old company set our positions to be.
Yeah.
So it was like there was very much a line in the sand of like the stuff that Kohl would do and the stuff that I would do. And we would obviously collaborate and always talk, but we were working under the confines of the structure that Acerna set up. And starting a company, what was new to both of us was trying to figure out that structure for ourselves. And we're still trying to figure that out now. But that's an interesting, I guess, like little tidbit or little just nugget of of learnings that we've gone through.
Yeah. I was fresh right out of the gate. We had to work through that. And I think it was good to have a resolution at the end of it and to carry on.
Exactly.
Because I could have set up yours and just stayed on and be like, whatever, man.
Yeah.
Go do your own thing. Waste your 5 months.
So we figure all that stuff out. So we're in the timeline of our past. We're around June of 2019. I leave the company. Kohl, starting June, goes through his wedding season, we'll call it. Then we fast forward to around November of 2019. So in November of 2019, for context, I had been working from home for the past 3-4 months. Every once in a while, I would go to a coffee shop. Actually, we would meet up, go for lunch.
Yeah.
But I don't like drinking coffee, so it was really just me buying a coffee to take a seat at a coffee table. But I started to feel personally that I was losing productivity, simply because I was so used and like so almost machine-like of like getting up in the morning, getting ready, going to a place to be productive. And there's an aspect of going somewhere to being productive that makes you just do better work. And I wasn't finding that at home just because I felt like I would get distracted doing laundry, cooking a really nice lunch or doing whatever it took to distract me. Yeah. I was really good for a little bit. And then after that, it started to deteriorate. At that same time, you were still working at Acerna and you were still doing your thing. But I started to almost get cabin fever, right?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to look for an office because I wanted to regain that productivity and regain that feeling of like going somewhere to be productive, and then separating church and state, like separating my work from my home life and my home life from my work.
Meanwhile, I'm still in the office. And I'm thinking about that startup life, working from home, because for me in developing software, all I need is a computer and an internet connection, and probably going to be okay. So I'm thinking about my house, my home office. And oftentimes you think about startups where you hear people saying, it's great, you get to work in PJs, you work in your underwear all day.
Yeah.
And it's true. And I was like, man, looking forward to that. I'm going to take advantage of that opportunity and not have to wear suit and tie we never wore that anyways, but
dress shirt, dress pant, and jeans. But what happened though is, and this I guess talks a little bit to our personalities as well. Like I found out over time that I work better and thrive in a more like lively environment where things are happening, where people are walking by and stopping by your desk to say what's up. And like, maybe you get distracted for 20-30 minutes because you're talking to like Justin or BK, like they just like swing by. Right. And like, you just like end up like hanging out. But I found that is an environment that I thrive more in. Whereas I think over time at Acerna, we found that like we're almost a little bit of the opposite when it comes to that, where like you can thrive very well by just like putting in your headphones, like shutting everything out around you and just like going deep. And so us getting this office, well, wasn't maybe necessarily the conversation that we had, or we needed to have a crazy conversation like about the equity that we did about the office. the office, from my perspective, while I know that I've known that that's how you work, which is like to be almost in isolation when you need to. The thing about that was important for me to getting this office was for when you were to start going full time, which ended up being December 1st, right? I wanted us to have a place that we could collaborate and that we could go to. And yes, we could have gone to each other's houses, but like the level of productivity and the level of engagement that we would have by going to a place to get that team dynamics going early was super important to me, because I know of how badly I personally deteriorated. And it's not to say that like we are like from a productivity perspective, it's not to say that you would have fallen down the same path that I have, just because we have different personalities when it comes to that.
Yeah.
But it was one of those things where, at least in my mind, I wanted to hit the ground running. And if we had this space ready to go, that means that we have the space, we have the ability to work together, but we also have the flexibility for whenever you want to work from home.
Yeah,
so you get really the best of both worlds without having to experience like the ups and downs that I went through.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how I thought about it. I felt like for me, that was a time where I needed to compromise a little bit more. And that's where, again, the balance of personalities has really helped, because you really push for that and you can see the benefit of it. In my mind, just leaving my job, my income going to zero, I was thinking, well, we're going to be paying a bunch of, like, we're paying rent now. It's like we're living together again. We're renting another apartment together. I was like, I just escaped that.
Yeah.
But the cost is so, and we can talk about numbers. Hey,
Yeah,
so like it's a two office, two room office, I guess. One great room that we can have a creative space, a flexible space where we got whiteboards, we got the podcast table, nice big table. I come in here and I'll do drawings. I'll just read or think in here. And then we got the other room where we got the computers set up, and it's a good, great space. And it was only about 10 or 10 and a half for the year, 10.5 grand. So whatever, 800 to 850 or something like that a month. So it's not crazy. It's actually really cheap in terms of office space.
Yeah, relative to other things in the market, it was a steal.
But in my mind, I was thinking, income is zero. Trying to figure out living with my wife and our budget and all this stuff is a little bit of stress that I was thinking about, that it was not maybe the right time to start getting an office. Maybe we should just work from home and use our resources for a minute.
Yeah.
The one thing that I liked that Adrian said was, if we can't make 10 grand in a year between the two of us to afford this place, then that's a sign that we got to close up shop. And then at least we tried, we did it, but at least 10 grand is not that much in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
And I thought, again, you know what? That's really fair. Our intent is to build a business that will generate enough revenue, more than enough revenue to pay for that eventually we start paying ourselves. So I thought, you know what? You're right. Let's do it.
And I think just from an investment perspective, like, yes, I think we were in the grand scheme. You hear all the time, like, oh, they started Microsoft in their garage and they were for the 4 or 5 years. And that's what people like fantasize about. And like, there's these guys that are just like in the depths of the computer in their garage for 2-3 years. And that's fine. But
I mean, that's what I was hoping for, kind of.
Exactly.
Like there's a dream. There's a little bit of a,
and it's one of those things that it's like, what is the opportunity at the time for those people, and like how is that ever relevant to us, right? Like it doesn't really make much sense. And I think that the big thing for at least like to justify the investment for me into the office is that even if at the end of the day we're a software company, we're going to be a small software company, and we know that like if we are going to be successful, it isn't for 3, 4, 5 years down the road, right? Like there is a long ramp up period, and that's just the reality of starting a company. And the investment was more in our productivity versus like it was more of an opportunity cost that I feel that we would have lost out. So that 10 grand for this office space to me is worth more in our productivity increase than it is to not do that, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's the big thing about startup companies, is because, again, so going back to like the whole like theme of what it's like to start a company, is reality is we are going to have a bunch of expenses before we have any revenue, right? And it's a matter of putting our money in things that are smart, or things that we deem good at that time. Whether they're smart or not in the long run, it remains to be seen. But that is just the balance that we'll always have to go through as a startup company. And anyone starting their company, it's no different than a company that's starting an apparel company or a clothing line. You're going to have to invest in that first line of product, right? You can go to the route of Kickstarter, of raising money before you produce. Yeah. And that's a very viable like business strategy. But for the most part, there will be a chunk of expenses that go in before any money starts coming.
And maybe that's me being naive a little bit and not going through business school and getting a little bit more insight into that. Wow. And obviously when we're working at a Cerna, it's like, here's your desk, here's a computer, everything, need some supplies. Everything's provided for you. Yeah. Going into starting a business, it still is something that maybe I'm just, I type white knuckled on the purse, because we got this beautiful big table. This table has been excellent, but it's like $700 or $800 right here. We got 3 mics and arms, and then we got tables over here. Go drop myself, $1,500 for a new work computer. Yep. There are a lot of expenses that go into starting a company just to get things started.
Right.
And that was a thing for me that was tough to not to justify, but to just accept that is just a fact. I think that you just have to get some things going so that you can even start. And then you could start to, I guess, debate, whether it's kind of necessary or not right off the get-go, because doing an office, we got to buy a water cooler, we got a microwave, we got some shelving to store a bunch of stuff. And there's a bunch of expenses that go into it. And like you're saying, I don't know how much numbers we want to go into, but I do think it's interesting insights just for people following along. But it's thousands of dollars that is invested before we even start anything by having an office. Yeah. But what comes from that, I think, is an expedited path to building something.
Right. Yeah, and I think that just generally when it comes to startup expenses, we do have different just general personalities when it comes to even just money.
Yeah, it's just, I think tolerance is a good word.
Yeah. But I don't think that either we're like a very conservative or a very aggressive like financial approach at this stage is, it remains to be seen if there is a right or wrong, or if there is, or what the actual impact of each decision is. Yeah. But I think that the most important thing is just making sure that like when one of us has an idea or has a suggestion to do something, as long as we both understand like where each other is coming from at that point, and like just talking through these things, especially at this stage where it's literally just the two of us that are here, we have 100% input into the decisions that we make, because it's just us. When eventually we grow and whatnot, you see it all the time with companies that are here. You hear people complaining like, how do they spend that much on marketing budget, or how much do they spend on whatever, right? Yeah. But it's like, right now, it's just the two of us, and so if there's anything that...
So it's just me nagging. How could you spend that much on a desk?
Yeah. And like, the reality is there's just a lot that went into, I guess, like, my situation that allowed me to be a little bit more flexible, given that, like, I wanted to make this... To make a full run at this, I wanted to make sure that like there was enough money invested in this that we could try. And if we fail, then so be it. Like, I'm completely okay with putting that money in and losing it to just time, or not being able to like start this company successfully. But I'm not okay with just starting the company and then not like that's the only risk that we take, and then stop taking risk taking from there, and then just like taking it easy from there. And then if we do fail, in hindsight, I'll be like, well, we could have done a million things differently, but because like we didn't, now I'm living in, like, now I'm regretful. Now it's like we didn't, like there was nothing there.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's just generally the issue that I had.
And I think that's good, because I think you're just going to keep taking risks. And I have to think of it as like a fishing line, that you're out there fighting for food, and I'm reeling you back, trying to find the balance, because I do take definitely a more conservative approach, and you take more aggressive. Not too extreme in either direction, but I think that's where we find the balance.
And it just goes back to the whole, like, that's how we balance each other out. Like, that is long-term why we will be successful, is because we do help each other out in more ways than just like our technical abilities. The next thing that we've had to talk about, or the next thing that we've had to try and understand when starting a company is how to balance our priorities, right? How do when we talked about this maybe a couple of weeks ago, where when you work for any company, the structure has been set for you, and you work within the confines of what the company tells you to do. And there might be 3 or 4 major things that everybody that works has to be good at, and that's like their job. And then there's a couple peripheral things that you have to do. But for the most part, if you can do those 3 or 4 things very well, you will have a successful career, and you will grow. And if you want to grow in your career, you want to increase, or you want to, grow up the corporate ladder, you just increase some of those responsibilities, and eventually you'll have a new job.
Yeah.
That's a very simplistic way of describing it, but I think that that's the experience that we've had to date. And one of the weird things about starting a company is that structure doesn't exist. We need to figure out what in your week, in your day, in your month, what is the things that we need to work on that will bring us to the promised land, that will grow this company into a success, that will turn this into a long-lasting organization.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think both, I can speak for myself, that I know that I've struggled with trying to find the right things to work on and the right things to put time in. And just what's your mindset, or what has your experience been like for the past couple months?
Yeah, definitely. Because especially as a programmer, if you are a pure programmer, you get a list of things to program, and then you program it, and next day you come in, same thing. Like you've very defined way of, and that's working for an organization. Mind you, if you're freelance, you gotta find your own way. But definitely a lot of structure to that. So that was a challenge even for me right from the get go, and the whole principle around creating a startup company and keeping it lean. You need to have some direction, and so there's a couple milestones that I think help us to figure out what we need to do in a week or in a sprint of a couple weeks perhaps, but it's always changing. For me personally, it was trying to find out what our first product is going to look like, because I couldn't even start typing on a computer until we had something. I don't want to waste a bunch of time, but then again, if you're not wasting your time, then what are you spending on it that's going to be beneficial or value bringing? And a lot of the time, it's unclear. That's the uncertainties. That's the risk of doing the startup. It's a land of uncertainty where you got to find out what you should be focusing your time on, and that's tough, and it's still tough.
Yeah.
So from the past couple of months, it's been constantly changing, and I've developed personally a couple strategies to help manage my time, at least when I'm wearing my hat of programmer, but product manager, whatever, all the pieces that come along with doing programming and working on our core product. But then you have other things. We have podcasts that we want to work on. We have consulting that we do on the side. We have just generally we need to raise money. We need to build community. We need to do a number of things that trying to prioritize those and find out what is the right way to do it is tough.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, again, like this goes to the difference in personality types, where I think I'm okay with less structure and not knowing, I think more than you are. But I think that the big thing where we kind of differ is the certainty. Like for me, it's that uncertainty. It like I'm fine like living in that realm, and it's weird trying to trying to find that balance between structure that we need and like prioritizing both of our work, if that makes sense. It's a little bit confusing without saying a bunch of detail, but an example of that is I think that things like the podcast or other versions of content is equal, if not more important than the product that we come out with.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily to say that that's like and our product is.
Yeah, I come out with my hammers and my swords swinging because I'm like, no, product is
right.
We need a good product.
And I think that my big fear is that like if we're not successful if we build a product that nobody knows about or nobody's waiting for. And that's where we kind of, again, we differ and we're trying to find the balance between trying to find a way to develop and to build a long-lasting, actually useful software versus building something that maybe the people want but isn't like completely complex and completely like detailed and everything that we ever wanted in there, right?
Yeah.
And so we're doing things like, I don't know if people listening, especially if you're in like the startup world, have read or know about like the lean startup, but it's a methodology that we've like tried to fully adopt, which is to iterate and to build various small validation points to test our product as we go. And even with that, it's very hard to start and like, what are you testing? What are you validating? Who are you testing against? Like there's all of these different questions that we're trying to figure out, but that is the thing that remains to be seen still with our company right now is we haven't gone out. And even with this podcast, like we talk briefly about our company, but we haven't even exposed to the people that listen to our podcast exactly what we're working on, right? Everyone that notionally knows, even like my closest cousins or friends and family don't really know what we're working on because whether it's like our fear or our like uncertainty or just general, like.
Well, it's just also a product of what we are doing is we've mentioned a couple of times working on a financial application of something. And we could say that because that is what we're working towards. But the whole principle of the startup is, and keeping it lean, is testing stuff and then continuing on with that idea or pivoting and trying something new.
Right.
And so we're not really being really upfront with stuff because it's going to morph and it's going to change over time. And what we say now may not be what it is in a year.
But I think that is our weakness, is that we are scared to talk about it more. And because we don't think that we think that if it's going to change in 2-3 months from now, we shouldn't be telling anyone, or it's going to change. So it's like we don't have any certainty about what the product is, but that's causing us to not build enough of a community or enough people knowing about what we're doing because it's our own like lack of potential like self-awareness or self-confidence in our idea that's causing us to have this approach, right? Because I think that if we're upfront and like you just said, we're upfront and open with the fact that like we are testing ideas and we're trying to figure out what the path is, but this is our idea as of right now. I think we can get people to be more receptive to that as a concept, rather than this, we're just going to hide in a cave and just continue to think that we're going to test things at some point in the future, but we don't have anyone knowing exactly what we're doing. Like, you talk to 3 of like the 4 of my closest cousins that I have, and all of them think that I'm doing something a little bit differently. Right. Or like, or like even just like a little, like some of our friends that we talk about, but it's because because we don't know, we lack the confidence to like almost stand up and talk to our idea, which I don't think is a good thing.
Right. But I think that is also a product of where we are right now, and that it is pure greenfield right now. We're still at onset.
Right.
And that kind of dovetails, I'm not sure if we're going to talk about that later, but to kind of what we're trending towards right now as a first user validation session, where we would actually take our idea, we'd sit down a group of people, show them our app to date, talk about different ideas, get feedback from them, and then get thumbs up, thumbs down effectively from friends and family at first, and then we'd take that back, learn from our feedback, and build that into our tool, so that then we can do that again in another couple of weeks or months and start to iterate on that and really refine that. So I think that is true, because it is scary. We've been making $0 for a number of months now, and there's some perceived expectation on us that we're going to go out and continue to build cool things.
But I think that is the issue, right? It's other people's expectations is why we're not as open with it, right? Like, you tell somebody that you're trying to figure out, you're starting a business, but you're trying to figure it out, and that person's expectations, or the way that person perceives what you're doing, is potentially hindering us from, I guess, doing more. Because yes, you're right. Everything is greenfield right now, and everything is unknown. But I don't think that. I think in a world where we don't care what other people think, it doesn't matter that that's the case, right? Like, we'll still tell people about what we're working on. That doesn't affect us, right? But it's because, like, you tell people you're starting a business already, people, like, they start to give you like this weird, like, oh, like, what are you doing? Or like, that's even like, or they'll like come and be like, oh, that's like really cool. And there'll be very superficial conversation, or they're just trying to nitpick everything. And we just don't want to go through that judgment, or we don't want to go through that. But the reality is like, half the time when something like that happens to me, I just want to say, like, fuck you, like, I just don't care what they think about. But it's also like, it's just this weird, there is this weird, aspect of like other people's opinions kind of influencing how, like, where we are today, because we don't have that confidence. When you work for any organization and you say, what does Shell do? Nobody's going to be like, oh, I don't really know. Like, I'm not really doing anything. It's like, I'm starting, I'm working for Shell. Like, they'll be like, no, like, I work for one of the biggest oil and gas companies in the world, right? I'm an engineer for them. And like, what you do in your day to day is X, Y, and Z. But like, somebody asks us that, and we're not as confident because we're in this greenfield space. And I just like in my core, I hate that like other people's opinion is like affecting my ability to be just like confident in like what I do, because that's never been the case, at least for me personally. And then there's just like long-term ramifications about like not being as clear about what we're doing. Our friends and family who we're about to try and get into a user group to validate have no idea what they're getting into, because we haven't been clear about what we've been doing. Right. And so now we're asking them to give us the quote unquote thumbs up or thumbs down with zero context. So now I almost don't care what they think, because they don't know anything about what we've been working on or how we've gotten to this point. Right. Yeah. Aside from a few like key individuals, but it's like, if we were to have more frequent conversations with just like, and like input, and I guess it's something that's interesting for the people that are like, even if there's a couple people listening, but it's like, when is too much information too much, right? And when do you just like, do you not care about this, or do you care?
The flip side of that coin is you almost don't want those people to know anything. If a tool is as intuitive as you'd hoped or as clear as you'd liked, we should be able to have people in and just give them the aspect, whatever, the summary, and abstract is what I was going to say. Take the summary and just give it to them, and then give them a tool, and then just see what happens organically without their kind of preconceived notions going into it.
Sure. Definitely. But also, like, we don't need to do that with our friends and family. Like we don't need to, if it is that like intuitive, we don't need our friends and family. The reason why we're going to our friends and family is because it's not, like they're the most accessible and it's not intuitive. So these people need to know what we're working on for them to know, because what we're working on, it like maybe 3-4 years down the line, it'll be intuitive of how like it all works and like the problem we're trying to solve. But as of right now, as early stage that we are, it isn't going to be all like glowing bells and whistles. You turn on Microsoft Word and every button, everything works as it should, right? But that's like the interesting thing about starting a software company is like we don't know how to. I think we don't know necessarily how to balance other people's feedbacks or like wanting other people's feedback versus going after something. And then at what point do you start to get validation? Right. Like there is this weird, we can't just test like every single decision that we make. That doesn't make any sense. Like at a certain point, you have to be strong enough in your convictions. And I think that to go back full circle is where I think that the uncertainty has led to some lack of confidence in. And that lack of confidence spills into other decisions. That is personally, I think, where like my like anxiousness or my potential like trepidation about what we're working on starts to seep in, because I don't like feeling not confident in a decision or needing other people's validation every step of the way. Like that to me is like the craziest, like I hate everything about that feeling, right? And even so, like the last story we'll talk about is we just submitted we submitted a submission to the National Bank of Canada, who was hosting a competition Canada-wide, which was generically help people come up with ideas to help people better manage their finances. That they left it completely wide open, but they are trying to invest in startup companies or startup ideas that will help people better manage their finances, which fits exactly in line with what we're trying to work on. And it was a very easy submission. We had to create a short video showcasing our idea. We had to answer a couple business questionnaires and submit our resume. Nothing too crazy. There ended up being something like 70 teams countrywide that submitted, and we were chosen to make it to the semifinals. The semifinalists were then taken down to a top 5, which we recently heard back that we did not make the top 5 finalists, but we're still waiting to hear feedback from the National Bank of just like their feedback on our idea. And that process of 2.5 weeks of getting things in order to get ready for the submission, it was a lot, because there was a lot of, none of the questions or none of the things that they asked us were things that we hadn't thought about before, or things that we needed like to just like come up with something new, right? We've been talking about this for the last 6 months, last year almost, and we just need to pull different pieces together and make the content specific to what they were asking for. But like, so at the start of the competition to the end of it, the two things that bothered me the most about the competition wasn't that we didn't make it to the finalists. It was our just like lack of confidence in our own almost like submission that required us to, like, getting feedback from advisors and getting feedback from people that we trust is super important. But it just felt like we needed so much validation from the people, from those types of people, that I just didn't like the approach that like where we were at. Like there was just like a lot of it that it just encouraged our need for other people to validate us or validate our, like, to give us confidence. And then the second thing was, once we submitted, I personally put too much emphasis on making it to the top 5 or wanting to like, you know, succeed in the competition, when the competition itself is like, we don't really know the top 5, and we don't know how what these companies are or anything really about it.
What the bias was.
But there's definitely going to be a bias in any competition. There was no guidelines, or there was no fair like scoring card that we all could have seen and just seen where we stacked up against each other. And so with that level of randomness or potential bias, even though I didn't think, like at the onset, I didn't think that we were going to make it to the top 5, just because it's just so random. But then I started to let external factors make me believe or make me want it even more, which in the grand scheme of a startup there's too many ups and downs to allow anything external to influence our like mindset, right? And those two things are out of character for me, to be like, to have this like all of a sudden need for external validation, and then this all of a sudden like this wave of emotions of ups and downs, which I like personally, anyone who knows me knows that I stay like fairly even keel, and I don't try to go too high or don't try to experience too lows, right? And it's both of those happened in the last 2 weeks, and it caused for it was just like a very like it was a very emotional couple weeks at least for me.
I know it was tough dealing with the sobbing in the office.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I don't know how you felt.
I mean, it was a similar situation. I think it was great that we made it to semifinalists, and I mentioned this a couple times, that while we're doing this, we intended on having a user validation session early in February, mid-February, to get some initial feedback on a product or an idea that we were building. And then this competition came in, and then we were able to use that in replacement sort of for that session. So we dropped the session, pushed it further out, and then went heads down straight for this competition. So to go through it and to continue to refine and get some validation and then make it to semi-finalists, such that there was interest in our product, and then to not make it to the top 5, I think is just as valuable as making it through to the top 5, because it gives us some indication early that there's interest, and there's indication early that something also needs to change, whether we just need to be further along in development or we need to tweak our approach. There is now opportunity for us to take those learnings, and provided we get some valuable feedback from the competition as well, we can take that and build that into our vision and into our product, into our market, and take it and run with it. So as well, pretty even keel. So I had hopes and dreams, I guess, but I wasn't as affected, I think, by it, because I don't know, maybe there was just a bias going into it, that maybe I thought we were too early, and so maybe I wasn't expecting to go through, or I don't know what it was, but I was pretty even throughout. But I think it's valuable nonetheless at this point. And hopefully that just means that there's just a new opportunity for us to explore.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, we've been rambling on for quite a bit now. And we have a million more potential stories that we could talk about, a million more things that we've gone through, but we'll cut this episode at this point.
Yeah. Eventually we'd like to get feedback from this podcast, because if there's people tuning in that like some of the stories that we're going through and they want to hear more about stuff, hopefully we can open up that so that we can get those questions answered.
Yeah, definitely. We'll continue to tweak. I think as far as the interview series has gone, your guys' support and feedback has been great. Some of you have even left comments about who you want us to interview next, and we're trying to work on all of those as we go. We will continue to refine and tweak our approach to these founders convos, but it is something that we want to mix in and throw into the rotation, so to speak, every once in a while, just so that you guys can get an idea of where we're at. For those of you that have made it this far, we want to say thank you for listening to this episode of the KAJ Convos podcast. As always, and as usual, you can find us at KAJ Convos on all social media platforms, on all streaming platforms, and on YouTube. You can follow Kohl on Instagram _KohlMeister _KOHLMEISTER, and myself at Adrian Bautista _ at ADRIANBAUTISTA _ Thank you for listening to this, I guess, second episode of the Founders series of the KAJ Convos podcast. Yeah. My name is Adrian.
My name is Kohl.
And just remember to keep it cash. See ya later.